This was day 687 of the Trump administration, and let's say this at the outset and make no mistake. On top of everything we have covered thus far, each and every night on this broadcast where the Russia investigation is concerned, this may have been the most consequential day so far. Prosecutors from the president's own Justice Department today straight up accused him of engaging in a felony. 3 new court documents fired by Robert Mueller and by federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York detail events involving Trump, Michael Cohen, and Paul Manafort, and have shed new light on these investigations and what could be an existential threat to this administration. Trump tried to get out ahead of it between 6 and 10 a.m. this morning with a fusillade on Twitter. Today, we learn much more about Michael Cohen's contacts with Russians on behalf of Individual One, which is how our president is now referred to in court documents. Mueller filed a sentencing document that indicated Cohen has met with the special counsel 7 times and has, quote, provided relevant and truthful information. Cohen told Mueller about, quote, his own contacts with Russian interests during the campaign and discussions with others in the course of making those contacts. He also, quote, provided information about attempts by other Russian nationals to reach the campaign, and said, quote, in November 2015, he received the contact information for and spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign political synergy and synergy on a government level. Cohen, quote, recalled that this person repeatedly proposed a meeting between Individual One, that would be our president, and the president of Russia. Mueller also says in the filing that Cohen provided useful information, quote, concerning certain matters, certain discrete Russia-related matters that should be core to its investigation that he obtained by virtue of his regular contact with company executives during the campaign, as well as, quote, relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House during the 2017-2018 time period. That brings it up to this year, and described the circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries while continuing to accept responsibility for the false statements contained within it. You may recall Cohen has already admitted lying to Congress about Trump's attempt to build a tower in Moscow while campaigning for the White House. There was also a telling footnote in today's court filing, and we quote again. In a radio interview in September 2015, the defendant, Cohen, suggested that Individual One, Trump, meet with the president of Russia in New York City during his visit for the UN General Assembly. The defendant admitted that this account was false and that he had, in fact, conferred with Trump about contacting the Russian government. Here's Michael Cohen during that radio interview, September 17 of 2015, followed by Trump just 3 days later.
There's a better than likely chance Trump may even meet with Putin when he comes here for the United Nations. People want to meet Donald Trump.
Your outside counsel intimated that you may have a meeting with the Russian president. Do you plan on trying to do that?
Well, I had heard that he wanted to meet with me, and certainly I am open to it. I would love to do that if he wants to do that. I don't know that it's going to take place. I'm not sure. I know that people have been talking, but we'll see what happens. But certainly if he wanted to meet, I mean, I'd enjoy doing it.
Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York also filed their own memo to advise a judge on Michael Cohen's sentence. It lays out all of Cohen's crimes over the course of several years, quote, willful tax evasion, making false statements to a financial institution, illegal campaign contributions, and making false statements to Congress. What's key here is about what prosecutors say about Trump and the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. Quote, during the campaign, Cohen played a central role in 2 similar schemes to purchase the rights to stories, each from women who claimed to have had an affair with Individual One, Trump, so as to suppress the stories and thereby prevent them from influencing the election. With respect to both payments, Cohen acted with the intent to influence the 2016 presidential election. And as Cohen himself has now admitted, with respect to both payments, he acted in coordination with and at the direction of Donald Trump, Individual One. That right there amounts to Justice Department prosecutors accusing the president of a felony. Cohen has been cooperating with both Mueller and the Southern District of New York prosecutors. He's scheduled to be sentenced next Wednesday. While Mueller acknowledges Cohen's assistance, the team in New York was less than impressed with his information. They argued that he deserves, quote, a substantial prison term, which could amount to about 4 years. In a harsh attack on Cohen, prosecutors in New York say he was motivated by greed and he did not deserve much leniency in exchange for cooperating with the government. Mueller also filed documents on ex-Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, who he accuses of lying to prosecutors even as he was cooperating with the government. Mueller says Manafort has met with investigators 12 times. He says Manafort did not tell the truth about a number of issues, including his contacts with the Trump administration during this year. Well, with that, let's bring in our front four, our leadoff panel on a Friday night. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor, Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, who in the past has worked for one Robert Mueller, and Jeremy Bash, former Chief of Staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. Joyce, I would like to begin with you. Did we get it about right that this is Trump's own DOJ just alleging that he directed a felony? And part two of my question to you is, if this were Donald Trump's civilian, would today's papers have included an indictment, perhaps?
I think that those are the perfect questions to start with. You're absolutely right. This is not, Robert Mueller and 17 angry Democrats making these allegations. This comes from the Southern District of New York, a venerable U.S. Attorney's Office that's tough but fair and charges people with crimes and has a great track record of convictions. So that's where this charge comes from. By the same token, if President Trump were Citizen Trump, he would likely be charged in this indictment. The protection that he has against indictment stems from DOJ's policy of being very hesitant, if not forbidding, the indictment of a president. And then I think in fairness to the president, we have to mention that this violation that he's charged with, the campaign finance violation, typically you hear prosecutors or police say that ignorance of the law is no excuse. When it comes to the campaign finance violation, though, prosecutors have to prove defendants knew that they were violating the law. So that's maybe the one outstanding issue here, is whether there's evidence that Trump, when he engaged in this conduct with Cohen, knew that he was violating campaign finance law. But that's a pretty slender hope for the president.
So, Frank, after a life in and around the law as an investigator, what leapt off these pages to you? And I have to say that when you look around the cable news sphere tonight, there are some trying awfully hard to say nothing to see here. Sean Hannity said tonight on Fox News he read all the documents and was ready to fall asleep. So give us a reality check. Just how bad a day was this for the Trump administration and Donald Trump?
Well, if Sean Hannity fell asleep reading this, he should sleep with one eye open, because interesting things are about to happen. As you've already said, our own government today has labeled our president a likely criminal, as directing criminal activity. Understand that this is not just about silencing women who you've had affairs with. This is about money laundering, as you pay these payments in a covert fashion to mask where they came from. It could involve bank fraud and other crimes. But what leapt off the pages for me, Brian, I saw a couple of things. One is that Cohen gave Mueller information about his preparation and circulation of congressional testimony. We already know that Cohen lied during his congressional testimony, but now we have seen something more, that he shared his draft testimony with unknown people. Why is Mueller telling us that? Who are these people? Does this reach to the president himself? Who was directing or telling Cohen what he could or could not see? Secondly, let's not forget what this investigation of Mueller's is all about. It's about Russia, an adversarial government. What did we learn today in this filing? We learned that Cohen was cooperating significantly with Mueller and providing information as far back as 2015 about overtures from Russians to get next to Trump and where this would go. And why is Mueller telling us that? If it's meaningless to him, he wouldn't even mention it. But he threw it in there because it goes to the core of what his investigation is about. He already knows what the Russian involvement is. Cohen likely corroborated that for Mueller from his end.
Jeremy Bash, I know you told one of our producers that what leapt out at you was the money, the huge amounts of money where Russia is concerned.
Yeah, December 7th, Brian, a date which will live in infamy for the Trump legal team, because I think today the full gamut of Trump's legal troubles were laid bare for everybody to see. And the thing that I really honed in on when reading the sentencing memo about Michael Cohen was the fact that the Moscow Trump Tower deal was going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are the words on the page. Hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing and licensing fees for the Trump organization, for Donald Trump. So just contemplate this for a moment, which is the government has proven through evidence that while Trump was securing the Republican nomination for the presidency, Vladimir Putin was authorizing a direct payment to him and his business of hundreds of millions of dollars. If that doesn't establish a very troubling pattern of financial impropriety and potentially outright bribery, I'm not sure what does.
Peter Baker, put it that way, and it sounds serious. In your early reporting, is there any accounting yet from inside this White House that anyone there views this as the deathly serious moment that it clearly is?
Well, it is deathly serious. It's a big moment in this investigation. We're starting to connect the dots. What we've had up until now is a series of disparate factual scenarios that didn't necessarily tell us the whole picture. And the only person we think has the whole picture is Robert Mueller. And once again, he's beginning to sort of show his hand, just sort of one card at a time, very carefully, very slowly. And it reminds us, I think, today, one of the things you get out of these documents when I look at them is how much does he know that he's not telling us yet? He's been very good so far about not leaking, about not producing information before he's ready to. And every time he puts out one of these documents, files it in court or whatever, we get just a tiny bit more glimpse of some fact, some scenario, some detail that begins to pull this all together. The idea that the Russians were connected or contacting Michael Cohen as early as November 2015, even though he says he didn't act on it, suggests that they were trying from the very start to infiltrate the Trump circle. The fact that Michael Cohen tells us that he was negotiating to try to construct this hundreds of millions of dollar building all the way up through June of 2016 is the other point on that thing. You draw the line from one to the next, and you start to see a picture.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.